Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is not a bad idea to speak from here, because after the sumptuous lunch we have all enjoyed, there is a certain heaviness that sets into human beings, including me, and by standing up I think I'll do better, and it may be that I will also wake you up a bit more. This is a challenge. But now, the title of this panel, Discerning the Present Through the Past, I presume means how the past influences contemporary developments, and maybe what are the lessons we can draw from the past. Now, as I was listening to the presentations this morning, particularly those delivered by Turkish political leaders, I detected that there is a general mood that has characterized this conference, or at least that introductory part, which is to trace the roots of contemporary troubles to Western intrusions into the area. It seems to be assumed that there existed a harmonious world prior to the intrusion of the West into the area. Now, is this true? Was the harmonious East, as Sharq as what Hanfa referred to it this morning, was it destroyed by Western intrusion into the area? Was it the artificial borders that the West created that constitutes the source of problems? Is it the West that instigated all the divisions in the region that otherwise would not have existed? In fact, when you read the concept paper of this conference, the concept paper tends to agree with this approach. It says, among other things, that the consequences of dividing the Middle East using lines drawn by the imperialist powers without consulting the people of the region have been disastrous. Weak states, divided ethnic and confessional groups, interstate mistrust and conflicts, lack of a national basis for the newly emerging states. I presume if this is the outcome of the imperialist intrusion into the region, had that intrusion not taken place, we would have ended up with strong states, unified ethnic and confessional groups, high levels of trust between states, absence of conflicts, and the presence of a national basis for the newly emerging states. I rather doubt this is what we would have found if the West had not interfered in the region. I will not deny, of course, that the imperialist powers have intervened in the region to serve their own interests, and these have had negative consequences for some of the local actors, but not even necessarily all of the local actors. But I will focus on the assumption of the general approach that I have observed this morning. I feel essentially duty-bound to do this because, number one, I feel that unless you diagnose a problem correctly, you will not find a cure for it. And diagnosing the problem exclusively in terms of Western intrusions into the area is probably an incomplete diagnosis. But secondly, I received my training as a political scientist. When I was studying politics, the textbook I used was Hans Morgenthal's Politics Among Nations, which was the preacher of political realism. We were also made to read Machiavelli's The Prince. In later years, I became a friend of Kenneth Waltz and sort of pursued the same line of thinking. So I feel duty-bound to essentially conduct my analysis in terms of sort of power politics and national interest. And I also feel duty-bound as an academic to tell you what I think, which is not something you may always like. Now, let me sort of try to reconstruct some realities about the past, the so-called glorious past. First of all, the so-called Sharq, or the East, is a Western concoction. Why are we the East and not the West or the center? You know, if I were to name it myself without others referring to it, I would say I am the center. So this is and in fact, you know, this sort of designation as being the East may be understandable in terms of people looking to the East and in sort of seeing in broader terms something that is not them and that is different from them, but certainly not particularly aware of the internal differences. Of course, there were, in fact, many politically relevant and consequential divisions in the region before the advent of nationalism and then also after the advent of nationalism. In fact, again, turning back to this morning's discussion, I was fascinated. We started talking about a Sharq. Soon the problem became redefined as establishing Arab unity. There are Turks, Iranians, and Kurds in the region as well. It seems that they are not quite as Sharq as the other Sharq, which is mainly Arabs. So, I mean, this is, in fact, whether you like it or not, a division. But, of course, the Sunni-Shia divide is one which is very, very old. There were no imperialists around when the initial divide took place. The divide persists today not only because of imperialist intrusion into the area, but because each sect has tried to suppress the other when it has been in power. In fact, in an interesting way, Iraq is a good example of this because the Sunnis had the upper hand in terms of political power. They suppressed the Shia. Then Americans forcefully changed it. Then the Shia began to suppress the Sunni. This is not necessarily something that the imperialists wanted or liked. Nationalism originated in Europe, but it did not take hold in the Middle East because it was imposed from outside powers as a foreign ideology, but because local intellectuals thought it responded to their needs. In fact, our Arab friends saw the ideology as a proper instrument through which they could end Turkish rule. But there were differences among the Arabs themselves. There were multiple identities based on sect, lineage, tribe, and in other words, Arabs did not necessarily constitute a natural political community. The Hashemites and the Sauds fought each other. Egypt and Syria, Damascus and Cairo each claimed to be the center of Arab culture, not to forget Baghdad. So essentially, the unity that is presumed in the debate essentially is not as much there as is assumed. And Arabs did not necessarily rebel against the Turks because the British deceived them or threatened them. In fact, they thought this is the way to end Ottoman rule, which I will agree with you had gotten rather oppressive over the years. I can give you other examples, but the point I'm trying to make is that the imperialists did not destroy a harmonious unity that was there. Rather, they used the existing divisions to advance their own interests. In fact, no outside power encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. No outside power asked Saddam to suppress the Shia, or later the government of Maliki to suppress the Sunnis. Where do current ailments come from? That is the question. This is what we have to deal with. Yeah. Religious and political identity, it seems, in the region is too closely intertwined or integrated. So collective actors often tend to be religio-ethnically based organizations. Political competition is between collectivities rather than between voluntary associations formed by independent individuals. The result is that little room is left for the scope of competitive politics. And this is a serious problem. Now, what shall we do to take care of this? Of course, the need is to create essentially autonomous space for politics, but this necessitates, and I'll use a word many people don't like, secularization. In other words, this necessitates a situation in which the belief systems do not constitute the essence of political competition. And this is not particularly easy to achieve. And of course, this needs to be complemented by what might be referred to as the emergence of the modal man. That is to say, an individual who makes decisions on his or her own without feeling obliged to sort of conform to the preferences of a group or a sect that he or she belongs to. Now, this requires, obviously, advancement in economic development. It requires advancement in industrialization, urbanization. But we still have regimes in the region that essentially legitimize themselves on the basis of religion rather than consent of the governed. So then we also have to build mechanisms in the area that allows for peaceful political change. But even when these mechanisms begin to operate, as it seemed to do so, for example, in Egypt after the Arab Spring, essentially what seemed to be taking place was not helping to develop mechanisms through which peaceful change could be managed, but essentially consolidating the results of change on behalf of the previous losers. And that essentially produced a military reaction. And I'm sure, as was also indicated, this will produce other reactions, but what we shall get is continued conflict rather than a peaceful state of affairs. And then the word multiculturalism was used rather liberally this morning. I'm not necessarily persuaded we all mean the same thing by employing this word, because multiculturalism does not mean the presence and cohabitation of different cultural and religious groups within the same political framework. It also means that they are equal. They have equal chances to participate in the political process. They are given equal chance to public jobs. They are given equal chance to public contracts. They are accepted as equals in courts. They are accepted equals in society. And in this sense, multiculturalism is yet to cover a lot of distance in the area. Can these things come automatically? No. History says no. In fact, you know, if we are to study, for example, how secularism came to Europe, we refer to major periods like the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War. And all actors in the end became persuaded that they wanted to live and let live, and we are not there yet in our part of the world. And we may also need to recognize that including external actors or mobilizing the support of external actors for your domestic achievements in a society is in the long run counterproductive. In the end, we must not forget when we talk about the Sykes-Picot, etc., that when the colonial powers came in, they always found segments of the population that were willing to cooperate with them. And then they pay for it. One might remember 1936 in Mosul with the Assyrians and the Chaldean heads on swords and bayonets. So, then, there's a lot of talk about unnatural borders. If anyone knows what a natural border is, please come and tell me after the session. There's no such thing as a national border. These simply are lines that determine who is going to be sovereign over which territory. Depending on the relations between those political systems, those areas may be areas of contention or areas of friendly interaction. So rather than talking about redrawing the boundaries, we must work towards satisfactory domestic arrangements so that people of different cultural, religious backgrounds can peacefully live together within the boundaries of the same state. Open up changing of the borders in the Middle East, and I can tell you, as we are seeing now, that the results are disastrous. So when people get the notion that borders are not going to change, they might view the world differently than they do today. So in the end, we must, if we want to make sure that war and suppression are not seen as the most reliable instruments of politics, we must work to achieve that. But we must identify the problems as they are, rather than pretend that they are produced by a set of external factors and assume that we bear no responsibility for what is happening in this world today. Thank you.